I recently sat down with my good friend Tim Tebow for a follow-up conversation on the role faith plays in his life. When he visited us last fall, he told us about a special day centered on John 3:16. The clip of Tim's John 3:16 story received an overwhelming social media response. We were completely blown away. It reached over 50 million people and has been viewed over 26 million times on our Facebook page. What I found interesting was that so many of the comments were thanking me for allowing Tim to talk about his faith on national television. I couldn't get over why people were thanking me for something I thought would be perfectly normal. Take a look at our recent conversation about all of this. Here's what's fascinating to me. On social media, when you were on my show and you told that story, which you wrote about beautifully in your book, Shaken, you told the story on the air, and it was one of the most overwhelming responses on social media that I've ever seen. Over 50 million people were reached. Can you remind everybody about the John 3:16 story? People can't seem to get enough of this story.
Well, it was a verse that I wore under my eyes in the national championship game when I was in college. And long story short, 94 million people Googled it that night. And then exactly 3 years later, playing the first round of the Pittsburgh Steelers in the playoffs, I threw for 316 yards, and my yards per completion were 31.6, and yards per rush were 3.16. Time of possession was 31.6, and the ratings of the night were 31.6. And during the game, 90 million people Googled John 3:16, and it was the #1 trending thing on all the social media platforms. And it was just amazing to see what God did with just a verse that I put under my eyes.
What are your thoughts about speaking about your faith on a nationally syndicated television show?
Well, I think it's important to speak about things that we're passionate about and we love. And I think it's important, if we are convicted about something, to share it, to not share it into condescending or putting anybody down if they believe something different, but it's in sharing it in a way of love, in a way of hope, in a way of faith, to support people, to help people, to love people. And ultimately, the Christian faith is about loving people. It's about loving Jesus first, and it's about loving people second. And there's a lot of people that, we can get into theology and they'll tell you a lot of different things about it and all these sort of things, but when you break it down, it comes down to those two things, love. It comes down to loving Jesus and loving people, and that's what we're trying to do.
Why isn't it the norm to be able to talk about your faith?
Well, I'm not sure, but I do think the one thing that was probably encouraging for a lot of people is just how big the God that we serve really is. I didn't do anything special in that story. I really didn't do anything. I put a little verse under my eyes, and God did something special through it. And the God that we serve is a big God, and sometimes I think we put him in this little tiny box, and we go see him on Sunday mornings or maybe at a devotional or something like that, or it's something we put on our Instagram, #blessed. And then when you're able to see a story about how an average person and myself just puts a verse under your eyes, but God does something special with it, it's like, no, we serve a really big God. We serve a God that does miracles. We serve the God that loves people, that gave his son for us, and that's what's pretty special. And I think that kind of is something that it reminds me of.
Tim calls himself average. He says he's an average guy. I can tell you firsthand, Tim Tebow is not an average guy. No matter what you happen to believe, Tim Tebow is an extraordinary guy. And in his book, Shaken, he opens up about his religious journey. Tim spent the early years of his life in the Philippines, and he travels back often for philanthropic work. I was shaken by one particular story in the book. It was about a little boy named Sherwin, who Tim met in a very remote village in the Philippines. This encounter with Sherwin changed his life. Take a look at this. Tell us about Sherwin. I want to know about Sherwin.
Well, I think Sherwin impacted my life probably more than any other kid that I've probably ever met. And I've met a lot of special kids, but when I was 15 years old, I was in the Philippines, and the Philippines is made up of thousands of islands, and we were in a very remote island. We realized very quickly it was the first time this village had ever seen visitors in the history of their village.
Wow.
And so they're freaking out. They can't believe they have Americans visiting them. They're touching our face, touching our skin, especially the girls with blonde hair. They can't believe it, because they've never seen blonde hair before. And so we gather everybody at the local high school, and we're there to share the good good news of Jesus with them, and it's my turn to share. And as I'm beginning to share, I see 3 boys in the back right corner turn and walk away. And then after I finished speaking, I did whatever I could do to get away from everybody to go see these 3 boys, because they were in my head and my heart. And finally I get around to the back of the school, and I see one of the boys crawl out of a bamboo hut about 200 yards away. The boy crawls in, and I crawl in after him, and I see the other 2 boys there in the bamboo hut. One of them's laying on his bamboo cot, and I see his legs, and I noticed that his legs were on backwards. And it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that, and so I was getting emotional, but I was fighting back tears, and I'm talking to these 3 boys, and I just had to ask, though, why did you leave? You know, when everybody's fighting to see the Americans, why would you leave? And the boy lying on the cot, his name's Sherwin, and he looked at me and he said, our principal really wanted to impress the Americans, and she told me that I am not very impressive. And my heart was just breaking, because that's the person we're supposed to be serving. That's the person we're supposed to be loving. So I pick him up, and all the Filipinos and all the Americans are out there, and we walk out of the bamboo hut, and I realized that all of them looked at Sherwin as cursed, because he was born with his feet on backwards. But you could see every step that I took carrying Sherwin, the narrative started to change in their heads, and they're thinking, oh, this message of good news, of love that you just told us, it applies to him. And so every step I would take, they would get closer and closer, and finally they would, touch me and him. But before, they thought if you touched him, you would be cursed. So I got on my knees and I prayed with these 3 young boys, and I told Sherwin, I said, Sherwin, I can't wait to see you in heaven. And he looked at me and said, Kuya Timi, which means brother, I can't wait to run with you in heaven. And this is a boy who has never walked a day in his life. And I'm just so thankful that I got to meet Sherwin and his 2 friends. And when no one else wanted to touch Sherwin, when no one else wanted to be around him, his 2 friends would not leave him.
It's a really beautiful story. Tim, we're so impressed by you, and we're so inspired by you. Your words just make us all feel a little bit better, and it reminds us that we all are loved and we all are worth something, every one of us. And I truly, truly believe that. Shaken, Tim's book, is available in stores now. And to learn more about Tim's charitable work, go to harrytv.com. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll be right back.